Good morning, everyone. I'm Louisa Savage, editorial director of Washington Post Intelligence, and I'm so glad you're here with us on Friday morning for our weekly briefing. If this is your first time joining us, welcome to what we like to think of as our strategic huddle. This is where we step back from the noise of the headlines and really focus on the signals that actually matter for leaders like you, whether you're running a business, shaping policy, or navigating global markets. We're building something new here. This isn't traditional media. It's really a premium analysis service built for decision makers and shaped by your feedback. So, what you ask in this chat or over a coffee later, it really guides our reporting. And my email's on your screen, and I'd love to hear from you. And a quick reminder of what your WP Intelligence subscription unlocks. Weekly intelligence reports. These are written like high-level cables with actionable insights for leaders. Incisive interviews with decision makers, a Friday newsletter to share with your team, a new downloadable graphics library to brief stakeholders visually. And of course, these live briefings where we pressure test assumptions and really try to connect the dots in real time. We want this hour to feel like appointment viewing, a rare space where policymakers, executives, and analysts are in one room together thinking out loud. So please jump in with questions, challenge us, and tell us what you'd like to see next. We want this to be your platform as much as ours. So today we are talking about the unfolding state and federal battles over AI regulation. And while I think a lot of the coverage of this topic has really been through a political lens, who's winning, who's losing, we wanted to make the focus here about A, what's happening, but B, what does this actually mean for business? What does it mean for anyone who has to make a business decision, a policy decision, or an investment decision that involves AI? And I think it's fair to say that that's increasingly most decisions and most people. So we have two great minds to help us walk through this today. Jason Dean is our lead AI and tech analyst, and he's recently published a very detailed report that you can read on our platform on this very topic. And he joins us from San Francisco. Welcome, Jason.
You.
And we are thrilled today to welcome Shannon Yavorsky, Global Chair of the Privacy and Data Innovation Group and co-head of the AI practice at Orrick, Herrington, and Sutcliffe. And she's a real expert on AI regulation and advises many companies on how to prepare for it. So welcome, Shannon. We're thrilled to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And I think you're joining us from, is it Boston today?
Yeah, that's right. It's the IAPP AI Governance Summit in Boston the last 2 days.
So you're just in the thick of it, talking to companies about what they need to do, how they're preparing. And so we'll get into that a little bit later in our conversation. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here. So here's how we'll organize our conversation today. First, we're going to talk about what is happening at the federal level. And with Shannon's help, we'll place that in the global context. Second, we'll dive into what Jason's been writing a lot about, which is the state level picture, where so many state legislators and governors have been incredibly active. And we'll talk about what is being regulated and what isn't and by whom. And thirdly, we'll devote a fair bit of time to talking through how companies and decision makers can navigate and protect themselves in this fast evolving patchwork landscape. So I'd like to thank our audience for all the really smart questions that you've sent in ahead of the briefing, and we've incorporated them in our plan for the conversation. And also throughout this hour, please, I invite you to drop your questions and your comments in the chat, and we'll take the relevant questions as we go along. We'll also reserve some time toward the end if we get a lot of questions to address them. So with that, let's dive right in. Jason, your recent intelligence report on our platform is called Mapping the Maze, and I think that's a great description of where we are. Let's start deconstructing this maze a little bit from the top down, and that is starting with the federal government. And let's start with the Trump administration. What has been their approach to regulating AI?
Well, the Trump administration's very strong position is that we should reduce AI regulation more than add to it. You saw that in the AI action plan, the signature policy document from this administration released in July that talks throughout about dismantling unnecessary regulatory barriers, criticizes the Biden administration for quote unquote onerous regulation and bureaucratic red tape. Pretty much every mention of regulation in that document is in a negative characterization, and there's really no discussion of issues of AI safety of the sorts that people in both parties, some people in both parties are concerned about. So there is people in the Trump administration have talked about the idea of having a federal framework of policy that would supersede state regulation, because they are very much aligned with the tech community and not wanting a state patchwork. But there hasn't really been any indication of what the Trump administration thinks that should include in terms of regulation. The discussion's been all about the U.S. needs to beat China in AI, and to do that, we need to unshackle the industry.
Sure. And Shannon, how does this compare to what is happening internationally in Europe? And Jason mentioned China. How are those, high-level federal and national governments approaching AI regulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the EU, we have the EU AI Act, which is the sort of first comprehensive AI legislation that is, we sort of thought would be a blueprint for AI legislation across the globe. And certainly in the same way that the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, has been a blueprint for privacy legislation around the world. We've definitely seen different countries adopting the approach and even some of the language from the EU AI Act to develop their local legislation. Some countries have been a little bit more hands-off and have been sort of, worried about stifling innovation, and have instead developed more self-regulatory frameworks instead of comprehensive AI law. So I would say there are different approaches emerging around the world. And in the US, we've definitely taken elements of the EU AI Act, but haven't adopted it wholesale.
Mm-hmm. And what about China? How are they regulating AI?
So a series of regulations were issued in China in relation to AI that have rolled out over the past 2 years, and that's been sort of shaping the discussion in China, and certainly something that U.S. companies have been looking to ensure that they can comply with the laws coming out of China as well.
Is there a particular focus to the regulation there?
So a lot of the AI legislation in China is focused on data use, safety, and security. There's a lot in there about cybersecurity, which remains paramount in sort of all kinds of discussions in relation to AI legislation.
And what about in Europe? What is the focus of the European AI regulation?
So the EU AI Act adopts a risk-based approach to legislation. It identifies certain categories of prohibited AI, which include things like social scoring, and then high-risk AI, which are, if you think about systems that could potentially impact individuals or have an effect on credit score, credit decisions, or employment is another example. And then another bucket of sort of general purpose AI, which are things like the chatbots. So that sort of risk-based approach is the way in which the EU AI Act has been structured.
Can you just explain what risk-based means?
Absolutely. So it sort of looks at the potential harms associated with a bucket of AI. And as you might imagine, for social scoring, there's really a lot of potential harm in that kind of activity. So that risk really calibrates how the law is drafted.
I see. And Jason, we know that some U.S. states are taking a lot more aggressive approach than the administration. But before we get into what the states are doing, let's talk about Congress. And if you would just take us back for a minute to the negotiations over the big, beautiful bill, the budget legislation, where there was actually an effort by Congress to put a moratorium on state action. Who was leading this and why was it defeated? And what is the status of that effort now?
Well, it's interesting. It was led by congressional Republicans, and it was substantially congressional Republicans who defeated it as well. It started in the House with the endorsement of Speaker Johnson. It's probably his most prominent backer was Ted Cruz. Um, Democrats opposed it, but so did many Republicans. Steve Bannon criticized it. Senator Rand Paul, Senator Josh Hawley, and Senator Marsha Blackburn, especially. She's been very prominent critic of the tech industry when it comes to a number of issues, but especially child safety. And that's obviously a huge subject when it comes to AI regulation. And so there were efforts to make a compromise to first of all, they had to satisfy the Senate parliamentarian who said that the original draft was not acceptable. They modified it. They shrank the period from 10 to 5 years, but ultimately they couldn't get enough votes, and so it was voted down 99-1. And the one yes vote is somebody who's not running again. I think that misrepresents the level of opposition. It's a much more divided issue. That was a case of, well, this thing isn't going to pass, so why make members who even some agree with it? I mean, Ted Cruz ended up voting against it. So it was like, why hang a controversial vote on something that's not going to pass? There's still a lot of support for the idea that you want some federal superseding regulation. We just don't know what that's going to look like. And for that report, I spoke to Dean Ball, who's an AI policy expert who served in the White House as senior advisor on AI to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And he made a very interesting point, which is that a lot of members of the Republican Party don't trust President Trump's instincts with respect to technology. They think he's been, as Dean said, bought out by Silicon Valley, and they want the states as a backstop. That's not something that Dean was agreeing with. He was just observing that no one will say that out loud, but in this environment, but that a lot of people in the Republican Party don't trust the president to keep the tech companies in check on AI, and they want the states as a backstop, and that's why I think that failed, and it'll be hard to resuscitate it, though there will be efforts to do so.
Yeah, and Jason, you mentioned Senator Ted Cruz. He's just introduced some new legislation, the Sandbox Bill. Talk about what approach he's pushing now, and is this new bill going anywhere?
So it's interesting. The titular acronym for that is short for Strengthening Artificial Intelligence Normalization and Diffusion by Oversight and Experimentation, which is quite the mouthful. But he positioned it as like a first step in a light touch regulatory framework that would include measures fighting nefarious uses of AI. But it really focuses on deregulation. And so this is a law in a context of discussion of regulating AI that really focuses on deregulation. It uses the phrase sandbox in a way that is not the normal use when it comes to AI regulation. And its primary focus is to enable companies, to AI developers, to apply to the government to modify or waive regulations that they consider onerous from federal agencies. So it's really a deregulation bill. I think that is not the formula that people are looking for. I mean, they may agree that there certainly is agreement that there are some regulations in place that are not helpful, but that is not going to answer the desire to have more regulation. This bill, I won't predict whether this particular bill will pass. I will say, I think it's, Senator Cruz is not necessarily a consensus builder here. And so you're really going to need something that establishes collaboration, not just bipartisan, but satisfies states, satisfies different factions within the Republican Party, and works with industry. And that's a lot of parties to satisfy.
That's a lot to thread. Shannon, we have an audience question that I think is really fascinating, and maybe you can help us with it. Someone wrote in, there doesn't seem to be any concerted effort to regulate AI nationally or internationally, and all of the developers seem to be going full throttle to get to AGI without much regard for guardrails, except maybe Anthropic. How effective can state or even national regulation be without having a strong international body overseeing how the technology, overseeing the technology? And then another person asked, who's going to figure out how to, quote, contain or define the limits of AI? So is this ultimately going to be all up to just every individual country? Is there any international body getting involved? I think that's a fascinating question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And certainly we've seen international organizations like the OECD get involved in articulating framework and principles that are sort of more self-regulatory. I'm not sure that there will be consensus as to what any kind of globally applicable legislation should look like. It's a really interesting question. I think what's happening now is that the states are going full speed ahead in thinking about the potential harms associated with AI and proposing a raft of legislation. And there are certainly companies that are working with each other to try to figure out what the guardrails should look like. And Anthropic is definitely a leader in that space with the recently proposed SB 53, which is a new safety bill in California that kind of replaces a bill that didn't pass over the course of the last year, which was SB 1047. And Anthropic has really put its sort of agreed that it's the right approach. And I think a lot of people are paying attention to this one, and it seems to have a lot of traction. And
right.
Anthropic made a really interesting statement there and said it's not whether we need AI governance, it's whether we'll develop it thoughtfully today or reactively tomorrow.
So let's segue to the states. Jason, from your report, I know that states have been very active in this area, more than 1,000 pieces of legislation touching on AI, but not all of them directly regulating companies. So can you just, before we'll go more into the California example, but just give us the overall lay of the land, so to speak. Which states are more active, and what are they mainly focused on? Or maybe just start with which states.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you said, that 1,000, I think it's a good indication of level of interest at the state level. But that number includes a lot of non-regulatory measures like resolutions and laws that are only tangentially related to AI. You can narrow it down in various ways. We narrowed it down to about 370 bills that were explicitly related to AI, of which 37 have been enacted. Another couple hundred are pending. You can narrow it down further. Dean Ball, who I mentioned earlier, looked at it, really drilled in, and said, there's a few dozen that are fundamentally regulatory, but that's a lot. This is in 1 year. These are bills that were proposed just in the course of this year, and obviously it's still only September. So we just had several passed in California. California has been a leader in this in terms of producing bills, not necessarily in getting them signed by the governor, but blue states very active. New York is probably more active in terms of bill proposals than any state, but it is not strictly partisan. No one's passed more AI related laws this year than Texas. It was the ultimate red state. So, and they have a pretty comprehensive law that was signed by the Republican governor in June. So, this is, probably the most sweeping and controversial AI law to date has been passed in Colorado, which is sort of a purple state. So this is really something that is coming to a head across the country and across partisan lines.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from the audience, and Actually, I have a couple questions from the audience, so maybe I'll start with this one, and I'll throw it to you, Shannon. Are there efforts by the states to work together on guidelines and a framework that can act as a foundation to avoid each state doing so independently?
So the states are definitely talking, and there is a conference of state legislators that is discussing state AI legislation. There's no sort of unified framework that's developed out of that, but there is at least, a discussion taking place. I don't think that's been terribly helpful in reducing the fragmentation that we've seen in the state laws that have passed. As Jason said, there have been about 1,000 proposed in, over the course of the last 9 months, and more to come.
Mm-hmm. Another audience question, are there current laws, GDPR, data privacy, et cetera, that will indirectly intersect the use of AI, which will have the effect of regulating AI?
So I love this question because I think that it's exactly right. And this is something that privacy lawyers were really thinking about when there was the proposal to, in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, to pause the enforcement of state AI laws. Privacy lawyers said, oh, well, that's okay because they're the privacy laws that talk about automated decision-making technology. So there will still be regulation that takes place. So I think here we're going to have privacy laws that are another sort of area of law that's going to regulates AI. Similarly, in Europe, under the GDPR, it was one of the first laws actually to have provisions in relation to automated decision making. So you're going to have to look at federal laws that will impact AI. Some federal regulators have said we're going to regulate AI as it falls within our jurisdictional authority. You'll have state AI laws, and then you'll have the whole privacy law regime that talks about automated decision making technology. So it will all have to be sort of read together.
It's a long audience question, but I think they're pointing out that the ISO/IEC 42001 is an international standard for artificial intelligence management systems that establishes requirements for organizations to manage AI systems responsibly throughout their life cycle. So what is the role of these kinds of standards?
So the ISO standards are well known to folks in privacy and security. There's an ISO security standard, ISO 27001, that many companies adhere to. It's an international standard, which is quite helpful. And the 42001, which is the AI governance ISO standard, has been a sort of helpful framework for companies that are looking to develop an AI compliance framework. It's one of a couple that people can sort of look to. OECD principles, the NIST AI risk management framework is another one, and then ISO 42001. And they all sort of set forth a number of different principles and controls that companies can implement in order to build out an AI governance program.
Mm-hmm. Jason, we started talking about California a little earlier. Can you talk a little bit about what California has been doing and how influential they have been with their regulations?
Yeah. California, talk about laboratories of democracy. California's definitely been acting in that role on this, as other states have, as I said. But I think people do look to the states, given the size of the population, obviously, and the size of the economy here, and the fact that the industry is located here. There was an effort last year to pass a bill that was vetoed by Governor Newsom that would have that had a lot of opposition from the tech industry. And it's interesting to see the way that was modified into SB 53 that Shannon mentioned earlier. It's called the Transparency in Frontier Artificial Intelligence Act. And that was passed by the legislature just this month and is awaiting Governor Newsom's signature. He has to decide in the next few weeks on that. And, he hasn't said what he's going to do, but that bill went through a process. The state legislator who wrote it really tried to adapt it to satisfy not only the governor's thoughts on AI, but also those of a number of companies. Anthropic is, I think, the one really prominent company that has come out and actually endorsed it, but I think others have given a more tepid nod that it's, they think it's better than SB 1047, the one that was rejected last year. So you can see state lawmakers trying to figure out ways to get legislation passed that gets around the areas of opposition. But that's just one bill in California. That's probably the biggest. The legislature passed several others in its latest session that just ended. There's one on robo bosses, as it's called, the automation decision systems used by employers. There are a couple about chatbots for kids that are trying to get at the issues of safety for children using chatbots, and particularly around mental health. We've seen some really, really sad cases of young people who ended up committing suicide, who were in communication with chatbots, the responsibilities there are difficult to parse, but a lot of concern about the role that those played. So there's a number of pieces and more coming. We'll have to see what Governor Newsom does on these. I think there's a lot of pressure on him from both sides.
Shannon, in your view, what is the main difference between the bill that failed in California and this new attempt that is starting to get some, albeit, as Jason said, perhaps tepid support from industry?
Yeah, I think that this bill focuses, SB 53 focuses more on safety frameworks rather than apportioning liability. And for me, I think that's a really key difference between the, SB 1047 that sort of failed at the 11th hour, and SB 53, which focuses more on developing and publishing safety frameworks, releasing transparency reports, reporting critical safety incidents, and includes kind of protections for whistleblowers. But it's more about accountability and building safety frameworks rather than liability, which I think is the key difference there.
Jason, I just wanted to go back to your report for a moment. You one of the things you did was you highlighted across the board, across the US, the most common areas of regulation. Do you want to just walk us through a little bit of where the action is right now?
Yeah, so you can see there issues related to child safety, particularly around CSAM, as it's called, child sexual abuse material, and also revenge porn, as it's called. That those top the list, broad concern, bipartisan concern on those. Measures related to elections, obviously, also something that there's broad concern about. Transparency, that gets to SB 53 that we were just talking about, and I would group in that sort of, and the next category, catastrophic risk. That is also something that that states are looking at, and that's something that the companies think should be addressed at the federal level, but there isn't legislation at the federal level. These are issues like the use of AI models for developing bioweapons, or in massive cybersecurity acts, and making sure that the companies are doing what they need to prevent those, and that they will be held accountable if they happen. The government use of AI is another big issue, and then the automated decision systems that we were discussing earlier are another key area, particularly when it comes to employers. So use of these tools for resume screening, video interview analysis, and candidate ranking and sourcing and sorting, and that sort of thing. Also another key area.
That is a lot. It's a lot to bite off in 1 year. Shannon, I'm curious, when you look across these different state legislative efforts, are you seeing any impact from what Brussels is doing? Is there any copy pasting? I think in some areas, Sacramento like to take its cue from Brussels. I'm wondering if that's still the case.
Yeah, I think we definitely see elements of the EU AI Act sort of as through lines in the state legislation. In particular, the comprehensive Colorado law really is designed very similarly to the EU AI Act. And we definitely see the consumer protection focus of the EU AI Act as a feature of a lot of the different state legislation. So it is a blueprint, but not in the same way that the GDPR was a blueprint, sort of cut and paste for privacy laws in the US. The EU AI Act has been more, I think, fragmented in its adoption across the US states.
That's really interesting. We have an audience question asking, have you looked at Utah's 2024 law, SB 149, that created the innovative Office of AI Policy? It's an example of a balanced approach to AI policy that has come from the state level.
So I haven't focused on the Utah law specifically. I don't know if Jason, you've looked at that one.
No, I think that approach though of setting up an institution in government that can take the lead on this is something that a lot of states have talked about or done, and was done at the federal level to some degree. But no, I've not dug into the Utah law in depth.
Okay. Well, I want to move on in a second here to navigating this maze of regulations. But just one interesting question that came in from the audience, and would love to hear your thought on this, Shannon. Will there ever be, quote, AI free labels in the future? Is that something we're headed towards?
That's a really interesting proposal. So there's certainly this move towards labeling, right? So a lot of the emerging state legislation includes provisions in relation to transparency and ensuring that AI content is labeled and that chatbots it's very clear that you're interacting with software and not a human. But I haven't really seen it the other way around, that something is sort of guaranteed AI free, but that could be a thing that we start to see as, desirable.
Yeah, or maybe
An
even not
AI free
regulated, but
experience.
maybe more of a consumer movement, like we see, whatever antibiotic free or what have you. All right, well,
Right.
let's talk about this maze and how to navigate it. Shannon, maybe you could start us off with just like stepping back for a second, like who has a stake in this? It's obviously not just the companies making the AI, right? OpenAI or Google who need to care about AI regulation. Who faces potential legal exposure here?
So every company that is using AI, that's developing AI, anywhere along the AI tech stack, but just everyday companies that are thinking about adopting an AI chatbot, or a huge use case is what Jason was talking about, was AI in hiring. Companies
Mm.
receive large volumes of resumes, and helping to parse through those, they're using a variety of AI powered tools. So I think every company that is onboarding different AI tools or developing AI within the organization needs to be thinking about AI governance and building an AI compliance program. And we're sort of at the start of that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I was just interviewing someone who I'll be speaking with on stage at the Concordia Summit this coming week in New York. He's a COO of a big company, and he was saying that one of the things that companies need to do is just track and inventory and have some way to audit where they are using AI, and this can be through all kinds of functions of the company. Is that your view as well, Shannon?
Yeah, so getting your arms around what AI is in use at the company is really the start of an AI compliant journey. You have to kind of know what's in use in order to develop policies and regulations around it. And it's been more challenging than you would think, because a lot of, the employees they find out about a really interesting tool, and then it's 2 clicks to download it and start using some really, fantastic thing that introduces efficiencies into their work. And they're not necessarily thinking about the consequences, which can be, okay, any prompt that's put into that tool is going to be used to maybe train that vendor's model. So it could, compromise company confidential information. So getting your arms around what AI is actually used within the organization is really the first step in building an AI compliance program.
That's super helpful. And Jason, in all your reports, you always provide actionable recommendations for leaders. And in this report, your first recommendation was to build business policies that anticipate regulation. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it comes down to don't wait. Don't wait for the rules to be passed. And, talking to people like Shannon and others, that came across really clearly. Identify the principles. You can do that by looking at the legislation that has passed and hasn't been signed, or has passed, or is deemed likely to pass. You can look at that, the various standards that Shannon was talking about earlier, from the NIST in the US and from international bodies, but there are consistent principles you can identify that you can bake into your policies. The key thing is to take action now, assess what AI is being used, as Shannon was saying, and that, by the way, what's happened in the last few years with generative AI is we've all awakened to AI and its powers have increased, its abilities, I should say. But AI in companies long predates the arrival of ChatGPT. So when you're talking about assessing where it's being used much beyond AI chatbots and the products you get from OpenAI or Google Gemini, Copilot, et cetera. Like the AI technology has been used in enterprise software for, well over a decade, in various ways. So that is a big task. But obviously it's much more front and center now. And, companies need to get ahead of the regulatory curve without, putting themselves in a position where they can't do anything, of course. But I think that is a doable thing if you start working on it now.
Mm-hmm. Shannon, so you're in Boston at a conference on AI governance, and you're talking to lots of different companies, and you do that in your day job as well. So give us some of the examples, or how are companies preparing to get ahead of the coming regulation, and is it really coming?
Yeah, so we're hearing a lot from companies who are building out their AI compliance programs. They're thinking through how AI impacts procurement, so adapting their contracts and terms to include AI, specific language. And the idea is to build a foundation, to build a principles-based sort of governance program at this point that will be durable and resilient to the oncoming wave of legislation. So as we've been talking about, there's so much that's in the pipeline right now in terms of AI law. And so companies that are, building this foundation now, building around core principles, are going to be in a very good place when these laws start to go into effect over the next sort of, 18 to 24 months.
And I want to invite our audience to please send in your questions on this topic, so we make sure that we have time to address them. Jason, your second recommendation was to be mindful of liability, and how do companies approach that?
I think this is a really interesting area, and one where there's already been some challenges for companies. I mean, it's not necessarily settled law. Some of the laws are trying to make it clear who has responsibility for AI systems if something goes wrong or there are allegations of something going wrong. So I think the first principle I would say is don't assume that problems can be blamed on the AI itself. Perhaps that seems obvious, but companies have tried that. I think you need to make sure that those responsibilities, in the way that Shannon was just talking about, are spelled out in your contractual relationships with AI suppliers. it needs to be sorted out. If something goes wrong, or there are accusations of misbehavior by AI, who's responsible between the AI model developer, the intermediary company or companies that build services on top of that underlying model, the company that deploys it. These are not obvious in this era in the way that they have been with some prior product categories, even in tech.
Mm-hmm. Shannon, what are you seeing show up in contracts now to address AI?
Yeah, it's there's a lot that's emerging in standard commercial contracting in relation to AI. Who owns the prompts? Who owns the outputs? Who's liable in any given scenario? And what we've seen is quite interesting actually, because a lot of the companies deploying that have developed new technologies and new services, they haven't actually been around for very long. So they may say in the contract, oh, well, we'll we'll indemnify you in case anything goes wrong. But if they've only been around for 6 months, we're asking our clients, like, what are you going to do if something goes really wrong? So we have companies thinking through those issues of liability. And there's this really interesting emerging class of AI insurance to sort of cover that delta that's emerged between, the potential risk associated with using a particular AI product or service that may not be covered by the vendor, and your regular errors and omissions E&O insurance may not cover it. So we're seeing sort of new insurance products being developed to cover that risk.
So we have a lot of very specific audience questions that have come in. So I'll just ask a couple of them. What happens when there are conflicting AI reports on a single topic? Who is right and who is wrong, and who decides? I think this gets to, what happens when the AI is wrong or contradictory. I know this is an issue, for example, that comes up a lot in the medical space, right? Like, is the doctor liable if he relies on the AI and the AI was wrong? Should the doctor have known better, or should the AI have known better? How do you see that issue?
So I would say there in that scenario, there need to be a series of sort of gates to prevent things like that from happening. There's, everybody talks about human in the loop. So making sure that there's somebody at the end of the equation that's looking back to make sure that, the AI didn't hallucinate, there isn't misinformation. And that becomes critically important in healthcare as an example. And then if things do go wrong, like figuring out the contracts or what the mitigation steps are. So I think it's a series of things: policies, training, human in the loop to, help articulate what that whole framework looks like.
Is this something that ultimately gets resolved by the courts? Like, is this a tort law question at the end of the day?
So I think there are a lot of issues of liability and tort that are going to shake out over the next few years as we new and unheard of scenarios sort of come out as a result of the use of AI. So I don't think that field is entirely settled just yet. It's really, emerging just now.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about liability, and what about IP? There's an audience question here. If a chatbot generates content through initial prompts entered by a user, and that user adds value to the content and saves a document back to the web, who owns the value add?
So that goes to really interesting questions of IP ownership, and certainly you'd look to the whatever terms the user accepted, and typically the terms of use or the terms of service will articulate whether who owns certain chats or iterations of the chat.
That's fascinating, and I guess we all need to start reading the fine print. This is a bigger picture question, going back to the regulations. What role has human rights been playing, if any, in the proposed laws and regulations? Does international human rights law come into this somewhere?
That's a good question. So I don't know, Jason, do you have views on that?
I think underlying principles are at play there, but I haven't seen uh, prominent legislation built around that. Per se, or around like trying to implement specific international human rights norms. I think there's a lot of, getting back to a topic we discussed earlier, there's a lot of suspicion in the U.S. of internationalizing the regulation of AI, and so while the principles may be consistent, I don't think that's been like a explicit part of the key legislation.
Shannon, there's a question here that kind of keys off of that. What are the core principles that you've both been referencing? I assume transparency and safety. Are there other core principles? So maybe this is another way of going at that sort of fundamental human rights question. Like I think non-discrimination was one that people talked a lot about right at the beginning of this whole AI regulation conversation. Are there others?
Yes, safety for sure, building responsible and trustworthy systems, fairness, preventing bias, accountability, and this is something we see in privacy as well, and ensuring that organizations are accountable for the products and services that they issue. Privacy is another one. So in ensuring that privacy rights are respected in the development of AI. I guess I want to go back to transparency and explainability because that's really a through line in all of the self-regulatory frameworks. So ensuring that users, sort of developers, should be able to understand how AI makes decisions, and then when something is developed by AI, going back to the discussion that we've had about labeling. So ensuring that people know when they're kind of interacting with AI rather than a human.
We've been talking a lot about commercial applications, but obviously there are a lot of other applications for AI. And we have a question here. The likelihood that AI and GAI or AGI will be incorporated into weapons of war seems to suggest international agreements and compliance may be very difficult to attain. Jason, are you seeing anything around that question? Like, are people talking about any international treaties like we have to control other types of weapons, whether it's chemical weapons or nuclear weapons? Or are we just too early for that when it comes to AI?
I think people are talking about it, and I think it's early. And I think also, I wouldn't rate the prospects super high, at least at this particular moment in history, given the two by far most important players in this are the U.S. and China, and their ability to see things in the same way is quite limited, to put it mildly, right now. I also think, and I think I mentioned this in a previous session, but you go back to one of the core principles, at least on the U.S. side of nuclear arms regulation, and people have referenced that as a parallel, and the old Reagan adage of trust but verify. The ability to verify in any kind of international framework over the use of AI in military applications much more limited here. Nuclear tests leave seismic signatures that you can detect. No, the U.S., China, they're not going to allow foreign governments to inspect their military AI systems. So it's very hard to see what exactly a framework like that would look like that would be actually enforceable.
And just going back to helping our viewers understand and how to anticipate what's coming and how to prepare for it. Shannon, you mentioned the coming wave of regulation coming in the next 18 to 24 months, I think you said, if I remember right. What are the main areas of regulation that you're anticipating that people should be preparing for?
So there are the comprehensive AI laws, the EU AI Act, Colorado as another example, and then similar regimes around the world. So preparing for the risk-based approach frameworks. And I think developing a principles-based approach to compliance will then enable you to then layer on what might be jurisdictional or sector specific legislation that applies to your particular company. Because as Jason was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of, thematically, a lot of the state laws are around sort of regulated industries. So in healthcare, so you'll have developed your sort of principles-based framework, and then maybe you'll have to layer on compliance for, specific state laws that apply only to your industry, or particular countries that have developed a separate or, more nuanced regulatory framework that you have to comply with.
Mm-hmm. And just given how many of these different regulations are coming and all the different jurisdictions that they're coming from, it sounds to me like there's enough there to keep, an entire team of lawyers at a corporation really busy, right? And across different specialties, across different jurisdictions. But what if you're a small business and AI is so, it's used across so many different areas, and whether it's, in your HR, whether it's in your, content creation or your customer service interaction. I mean, you can just go on and on. How are small businesses supposed to be compliant in this sort of ever-changing and patchwork world? I'm just curious to get both of your thoughts on that. Maybe Shannon,
So
we could start with you and then kick to Jason. Yeah.
I'll kick off. So I feel like it depends on the small company. If it's a small company that's using an AI tool for marketing, maybe the risk is not going to be arguably very significant. If that small business is, on the other hand, in healthcare or is a fintech and may have, be developing AI that has a potential impact on consumers, you need to think about risk in a little bit of a different way. So for regular, small companies that are adopting sort of, basic AI tools that arguably aren't going to have a really big impact, I would say, the risks are pretty low. But for other organizations that are maybe in the regulated space, you should really talk to legal counsel to make sure that you've, mitigated your risk appropriately, like looked at what the potential IP risks are, what the potential risks are associated with whatever tool you have that is, could hallucinate or have misinformation, the potential for bias and discrimination. So I think you just need to be really thoughtful in doing a kind of AI risk assessment, even for small businesses.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts from you on that, Jason?
Yeah, I would just add, when it comes to tech companies, even AI companies, this concern, who theoretically at least know more about the technology, this is still a concern, and it's one of the chief objections that the industry and its allies have raised when it comes to the idea of this supposed, so-called patchwork approach to regulation. It is extremely complicated to comply with dozens of different state laws, not to mention international regimes. And that's something that, the argument, and it's pretty compelling, I think, is that really advantages the giant incumbents. So if you're concerned about tech power in the hands of big tech companies, they are the ones that have giant armies of lawyers who can navigate this. The tech startups that are trying to innovate and develop the new technologies we'll be using down the road don't. The problem is that no one has really come up with that federal policy framework that could give the states a level of confidence that they don't need to take the regulatory reins in their own hands.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, is there any momentum behind doing that, or is industry starting to ask for that more?
I think industry is shifting the discussion. It's a notion that's always been there, but to the idea of preemption from a moratorium, and that is the idea there is that you have laws that will supersede, stand in the specific proposals, that have the kind of cooperation and compromise across the different factions involved here that might get them passed. I think we've yet to really see.
Mhm, mhm. Well, one thing we always do in our Friday briefings is give people just something to look ahead to. And Jason, give us a preview of what you'll be covering next week for our subscribers and what they should be looking for and thinking about in the weeks ahead.
Yes, well, as you alluded to earlier, we at the Washington Post Intelligence next week will be in New York for the UN General Assembly and the Concordia Annual Summit, and hosting meetings of our own council members and other guests. So if anybody out there is in New York, look us up. And in the next couple of weeks, I will be looking more at AI and energy and also at the economic impacts of the AI boom and the questions about whether we're in a bubble, and the implications of that, as well as more on AI and coding.
Awesome. I love all your reports. Every time I get to edit one is really exciting for me. Shannon, what about you? What are you working on next after this conference? And what should our audience be keeping an eye on in the coming weeks?
So I think the buzzword of the new focus for everyone is agentic. So
Mm.
companies adopting AI agents for a variety of purposes and thinking through all of the potential issues associated with deploying an AI agent to start going off and doing different tasks on its own. So lots in for lawyers to think about potential risks associated with what that agent is doing, again depending on how risky it is. So AI agents is a really a huge focus. Algorithmic pricing is something that we've seen a lot of regulatory focus on. We've had a lot of questions from our clients on where things are going with algorithmic pricing. But I think those are the two that come to mind as being really, really topical right now.
Well, we're certainly going to stay in touch with you, Shannon, because you're doing all the interesting stuff. That sounds fascinating. Obviously, this is a hugely fast moving issue and one we will continue to cover closely. But in the meantime, please be sure to subscribe to our Friday newsletter. It's on the Washington Post website, wapo.st/intelligence. And you can request a demo of our platform by clicking the link on your screen. And please block your calendar for Fridays at 11. That's our regular briefing spot. We'll be back here next week talking about what we heard at UNGA and going deep on tariffs and trade. I'll be joined by our global security analyst, Josh Rogan, and he'll be talking about what global trading partners can learn from the US-Japan trade deal. And I'll give you a preview. It really has to do with what it said about investment in the US and the sort of confusion it's created about what the administration is actually expecting from its trading partners. So in the meantime, we'll send you a link to a recording of this briefing if you'd like to look at it again or share it. And we ask that please take a moment to fill out a very short post-briefing survey. Your input shapes what we do, and we read all those surveys and take note of all your feedback and recommendations. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next Friday. Have a wonderful weekend.